All right, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Lord, we're thankful again for the opportunity to come and open your word and have you speak to us and give us those kernels, those nuggets of truth that you have for each of us. Pray you will anoint your word as it goes out, anoint my lips to speak those things that you'd have said, and anoint our hearts that we'd receive those things for each of us. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. All right, tonight this is going to be a little different because what we're looking at here is a song, very much like a psalm in one of the Psalms. But this is the Song of Deborah. And it's been said that it's one of the most perfect songs and in the Hebrew's form of poetry. It's really a very interesting song. And we're going to learn a lot of things in here that we didn't learn from the telling of the story. Okay? We find more out in here than we knew from the story. So let's start off. Now I've divided this up into very short, there's 31 or 32 verses, and I've divided this up into very short pieces, and because the song itself, as does a lot of the Hebrew poetry, jumps around a lot and moves from point to point very quickly. And so I've kind of divided this out so it'll make it a little easier to kind of understand. So let's start Judges chapter 5, beginning with verse 1. Then Deborah and Barak, the son of Abinoam, sang on that day, saying, when leaders lead in Israel, when the people willingly offer themselves, bless the Lord. Hear, O kings, give ear, O princes. I, even I, will sing to the Lord. I will sing praise to the Lord God of Israel. Lord, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the field of Edom, the earth trembled, and the heavens poured. The clouds also poured water. The mountains gushed before the Lord. This Sinai before the Lord God of Israel. All right, so this, as you can tell, is a very, very, I love the feeling of this song. It's very forceful. It's very full of praise. There's no negative anything in it. It's very positive. And notice something, that Deborah and Barak, they sang a duet. They sang a duet. And very much in the Hebrew tradition, more than likely, the second verse, for instance, when leaders lead the way, when people willingly offer themselves, bless the Lord, then the men would come in either with the bless the Lord, or they would come in with Hear, O Israel, here. So there was a song and response kind of a song, is basically how a lot of these songs were actually sung. So here, number one, we find out that at some point after the victory over Sisera, that Deborah and Barak sang this song. It was probably composed by Deborah. It sounds like it was. It has some prophetic stuff in it, so it was probably composed by Deborah. Now, what does this mean? When leaders lead in Israel, when the people willingly offer themselves, bless the Lord. Does that mean the only time you can bless the Lord is when the leaders lead, the people follow? No, not really. What we're getting at here, what the song is getting at, that Israel was able to bless the Lord because of the victory. They were able to bless the Lord because of the victory. You know, it's difficult to bless the Lord if you haven't experienced a victory. If you're in a hard place, now, they had just come through a time of here were these Canaanites and the Philistines, and they were all oppressing Israel. And we had this Jabin up here who was ruthless. And in that condition, it was hard to bless the Lord. And don't we see that today when we're down in the mully? Isn't it hard when we're down in the mully grubs and nothing's going right and everybody's come? It's difficult to bless the Lord.
Yeah.
But when we have something specific to bless the Lord for, it becomes easier to bless the Lord. Now, what makes it easy to bless the Lord? Number one, leaders have to lead. Leaders have to lead. Now, there were a lot of leaders in Israel. Deborah was a leader. She was a judge. All right? But what was Deborah doing? Sitting under a tree judging. All of this stuff was going on, and Deborah was sitting under a tree sitting under a tree judging. There was no victory. There was no reason to bless the Lord. She was going about her business. She was the judge. She was judging. But when it came time for a leader to stand up and lead, Deborah stood up, called Barak, and said, "Go get the army together.
Yeah.
We're going to go." You see, when the leaders stand up, and we're going to see more on this, she talks more about this in this song. She puts herself in that position. When leaders lead, when they get out in front, they have a plan, they know where they're going, they know what the situation is, and they ask people to follow them. When they lead, and the people willingly follow, you will have victory, and you can bless the Lord. It takes two things. It takes leaders that will lead, and it takes followers that are willing to follow. Like I've said so many times, if you're a drum major leading the band and you turn around and there's no band, you're not leading anybody.
Right.
They're not there. You may be leading yourself. If people don't follow you, you are not leading. It's that simple. There's no mystery to that. And so that's what David is talking about. Now, also, notice this. When Barak called the army together to meet him up on Tabor, now you put yourself in that time frame, in that situation. You got a guy down here that has chariots, a whole boatload of chariots, iron chariots. He's got a big army, and you're sitting over here with limited experience, and here comes a guy along Barak, and he says, "Let's get the army together." Deborah said, let's get an army together, and we're going to go fight Sisera. There was nothing to force anybody to join the army. There was no king. There was no central ruler in Israel. Deborah was a judge, but she wasn't the ruler. So the people had to willingly go to Mount Tabor. Nothing was there to force them to go. And we'll see again more about that as we go through this. So when you think about it, it wasn't a situation where they had a standing army and the general walks out and says, "Okay, army, we're going to go to battle," and they all salute and say, "Yes, sir, you're the commander, we're in the army, we got to go." They didn't have to go. It was strictly voluntarily that they went. But look at what happens when we get that kind of cooperation. We can bless the Lord because we will have victory. Nobody can force anybody to do anything for God. We have a pastor, but the pastor can't force us to do anything. He can't do it. He can lead us there, It's like to say you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. It doesn't work. And I know how true that is. You can take a dog, and never mind, I'm not going to get into my dogs. Take them off, heads off, something. But anyway, you can lead people to a point. You can give them all the tools, but it takes cooperation and people voluntarily committing themselves to the cause. Now, when they had this victory, bless the Lord, look at verse 3. Hear, O kings. What kings? Kings of all the surrounding areas. You had the Amorites and the Amalekites, and you had all of these people. You even had the Philistines, and you had small kingdoms within these groups. You had these lesser kings that ruled over cities, or little groups of cities. So you had all of these kings in the surrounding area. It says, "Hear, O kings, give ear, O princes. I, even I, will sing to the Lord. I will sing praises to the God of Israel." And you say, so what? Go over there and sing all you want. Why do these guys care? Again, there's a meaning here. You come against us. You keep pestering us. You keep harassing us. And we are going to be able to sing praises. That means we're going to have victory over you. We are going to defeat you just like we defeated Sisera's army. Now, how did they do that? Well, we'll find that out here in just a minute. We get into some real detail about this battle that's really interesting. But what we see here, when leaders lead, when people follow, you have victory. When you have victory, you warn everybody else around you. You better stay away from me because, why? I am going to sing a victory song over you. See, I'm going to sing praise to the Lord. Why? Because of victory. That's what this whole concept that she's presenting here is. Notice this, verse 4. Lord, when sire, when you marched from the field of Edom, the earth trembled, and the heavens poured, the clouds also poured water. Now, when did this happen? Anybody remember a Bible story that sounds anything like this?
When the sun and dawn?
No, you don't really. I mean, this is something that we're learning something new here. We're learning a little something about how God brought victory. Now, when Israel marched to Kadesh from 40 years in the desert, they come to Kadesh, they're ready to cross Jordan. We all know the story. Joshua led them across. And the Bible just says that God went before them and they had a mighty victory. Okay. Well, look what this says. It says here that when you went out from Seir, now Seir was actually means the hills that are on the east side of the Jordan River. And it's up by, it's a mountain up there actually. And it's right there by Kadesh, where they cross the Jordan River. Now, you have to kind of remember now, 40 years in the wilderness, God went before them as a cloud by day and a fire by night. He protected them. He went before them in battle. I mean, he was supernatural doing things. Well, doesn't it stand to reason that when they went into the land of Canaan, that he would supernaturally go before them? This stands to reason. It's not part of the narrative that we find in Exodus or Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. It doesn't cover this particular part of what happened. So let's look at this. Psalm 68, verses 7 and 9. O God, when you went out before your people, when you marched through the wilderness. Selah, pause, consider. The earth shook. The heavens also dropped rain at the presence of God. Sinai itself was moved at the presence of God, the God of Israel. All right? So what we're hearing from David is that when they went to Sinai, we know it was earthquakes. We know there was, from the account that there was rumblings and there was all kinds of... Well, here David adds in that there was a downpour, there was rain, there was a storm, there was all kinds of things that was going on when they got to Sinai. All right? Verse 9, you, O God, sent a plentiful rain, whereby you confirmed your inheritance when it was weary. What is his inheritance? It was the land of Canaan. That was the inheritance that was given to Abraham, remember? You're going to possess this land. It went from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, to, down the line. They all had this promise, this inheritance, that Canaan would be theirs. Today, it's the same inheritance. The land of Israel, Canaan, is and will belong to, and does belong to, the Jews. It is their inheritance. So notice what he says here. He says, you sent a plentiful rain. Now that word plentiful means in abundance. In abundance of rain. Wherefore, by that rain, you confirmed inheritance when it was weary. What was weary? The inheritance. It had been under the control of heathens, of the Philistines, all of these people. Describing that was the land was weary. It was tired of being subjected to these inhabitants that were not part of the inheritance. Your congregation dwelt in it. You, O God, provided from your goodness for the poor. The Lord gave the word. Great was the company of those who proclaimed it. Kings of armies flee. They flee, and she who remains at home divides the spoil. What is all of this? What is all this? Well, who is the congregation? Israel, right, yeah, the congregation, Israel. So what we see here is we get this picture that God came to Mount Sinai with thunder, lightning, earthquakes, storms, rain, just a tremendous outpouring of the power of God in nature, or as we call it, nature. When they went into the promised land, God went before them with exactly the same thing and subdued the inhabitants of Canaan, so that when Joshua marched in with his army, it was a cakewalk, basically. They were able to march in and defeat anybody that got in their way. That's why we don't see a lot about really heavy armies and battles, and we do some, Ai, and of course there was Jericho, and Jericho. Remember Jericho? Walls fell down on that one. But you see, what we didn't get was the story of how God preceded them. It just said God went before them. How did he go before them? What did he do? We see God goes before them. What does he do? Does he walk around the country in front of them and say, okay, here I am. Come on, guys, follow me. No. He went in and prepared that land of Canaan for the inhabitants so that their victory would be assured. But what did it take? Leaders who would lead and followers would willingly follow. And if we read the story of Joshua, what do we find? They went partially into the country. The leaders ceased to lead, and the followers ceased to willingly follow. They said, oh, we're happy here. Let's just stay right here. Yeah. Manasseh, they got half of Manasseh said, oh, we don't want to go over the Jordan River. That's too, we'll just stay here on this side. Gad, oh no, we don't want to go. We're happy, right? Oh, this is wonderful country for us. We can raise our sheep over here in these hills in Jordan, where it is now Jordan, and we can just do wonderful here. God said, go into the promised land. They said, no, we're going to stay on this side. We like it better. They got into the promised land, and they got so far through it, and they said, well, we don't want, oh, we'll leave those people. Those are nice people. We'll leave them alone. We're not going to do what God wants. We're not, leaders aren't going to lead. We're not going to do what God says because, they're nice people. We need some friends.
Is that why they're having so much trouble now?
That is exactly why they are still having trouble today. Who are the Palestinians?
Yep.
Yeah. They're made up of the remnants of these various tribes that lived in there, were never driven out.
Right. Yep.
So they still have problems. Yep. Why? Leaders didn't lead, people didn't follow. God made the way. Now let's read on down through here. Notice verse 12. Kings of armies flee, they flee, and she who remains at home divides the spoil. Who divided the spoil? The ones who didn't flee. Who didn't flee? Israel. Okay? Though you lie down among the sheepfolds, you will be like the wings of a dove, covered with silver, and her feathers with yellow gold. When the Almighty scattered kings in it, it was white as snow in Zelmon. In other words, this is poetic form, but what he's saying here is, even though you're just sitting in the sheepfolds, in other words, you're not an army guy, you're not out there fighting battles, God has gone before you, and even though you're just sitting in the sheepfold, what are you going to get? Well, kind of interesting. It says you will be like the wings of a dove, covered with silver, and the feathers with yellow gold. That speaks about bounty, spoils. What you will get from the kings who flee. And even though you're not a warlike people, God never intended Israel to be a warlike people. He told, look at the promises to them. You're going to go, you're going to be able to partake of a land that's full of honey, and it's got grapes, and it's got everything. I am going to take care of you there. All you'll have to do is enjoy this land that I have prepared for you. He never intended them to be a warlike people that was going to war against everybody. He wanted them to lay down in the sheepfold. He wanted to just cover them with silver and gold and just make them prosperous. But they had their own ideas. And to this day, they have not been prosperous. That day is coming, but not now. Notice Habakkuk chapter 3, verses 3 to 16. God came from Timon, the Holy One from Mount Paran. Selah, again. Pause, consider. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. Victory. Oh yeah, victory. His brightness was like the light. He had rays flashing from his hand, and there his power was hidden. Before him went pestilence, and fever followed at his feet. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and startled the nations, and the everlasting mountains were scattered. The perpetual hills bowed. His ways are everlasting. What is this all talking about? Wow. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian trembled. O Lord, were you displeased with the rivers? Was your anger against the rivers? Was your wrath against the sea that you rode on your horse, your chariots of salvation? What is this talking about? This is a description of this battle that we're talking about. Okay? It talks about, before him went pestilence, and fever followed at his feet. Where did the pestilence and fever come from? He said he stood and measured the earth. He looked and startled the nations, and the everlasting mountains were scattered. What was this scattering? What was they talking about? The everlasting mountains are the mountains that are in Ephraim and in central Israel. That's the everlasting mountains. They're everlasting because they've been given to the children of Israel as an everlasting inheritance. It says they were scattered. Were the mountains actually scattered? No. But when you have tremendous storm with earthquakes and you have rain pounding down and the water is gushing off of these mountains, it's like scattering the mountains. Your bow was made, and he said, he asked, are you displeased with the rivers? God, are you angry at the rivers? Why would somebody ask that question? This is Habakkuk now, writing about what happened. He's seeing this in his mind's eye. And he's seeing all of this, and he asks God, are you mad at the rivers? God, are you mad at the rivers? Why would he be mad at the rivers? What happens when you have a gully washer downpour? Well, if you're down in my brother, lives in Tucson, and it's interesting down, it's hot, desert, and you're driving down the roads, and all of a sudden you go over these little bridges, and there's these big things, you go over these bridges. I said, what do you need bridges out here for? There's nothing out here but sand. He said, you let a rainstorm come along.
Yeah.
And every year, cars get washed off of the road and people are killed by the force of the water that comes down these gullies and just washes everything away. That's what they're describing here.
Flood flashes,
Flash floods? Flash
flash
floods.
Flash
floods.
floods, there you go. Yeah, these flash floods. And so he said, God, are you angry at the rivers? I mean, they're raging and they're toiling. You can just imagine this boiling water. And this was a little stream we used to step over, and now it's just a raging torrent. Was your anger against the rivers? Was your anger against the sea? It says you rode the horse, the chariots of salvation. What is it? You can see this coming out of the sea. Storm. It's like the storms on the Sea of Galilee. They just come up almost out of the sea. These storms just start raging. And that's what he's saying, the horse, your horse of salvation, it comes up and it's full of terror, and it's full of thunder and lightning and rain and hail and all kinds of stuff happening. And are you angry with your creation? Verse 9, your bow was made quite ready. Oaths were sworn over your arrows. Selah. God swears. You know what he swears? It says he swears by himself. When he makes an oath, when he decides to do something, it is an oath, and nobody's going to change that. And it was over his arrows. It says, you divided the earth with rivers. Well, we were out there, and you remember that was desert. I would hate to spend any time. There was nothing out there. I never saw anything attractive about any of those mountains. They were just mountains mostly full of sand, or barren land, and the valleys were. But it says you divided those with rivers. You put so much rain down that it formed rivers in the valleys where it was flat. You know, it didn't used to have much water. Now there's rivers flowing down through there. Whoa. The mountains saw you and trembled. The overflowing of the water passed by. The deep uttered its voice and lifted its hands on high. Can you picture that? You know, the deep. Here's all this water rushing into the sea. And the deep is usually a term for the sea. And there's so much rain, and there's so much turbulence, and all this water is rushing into the sea. And you know what happens? It starts to forming these huge waves. And you know, if you know, they shoot up in the air. I think about Hawaii. If you go out there and watch the waves when they hit those rocks, you know, they shoot way up in the air. The deep is raising its hands. It's shooting up. What a description Habakkuk is giving here. The sun and the moon stood still in their habitation. At the light of your arrows they went. At the shining of your glittering spear. Now, I don't believe here he's talking about the earth and the sun and moon actually standing still. That happened, but not in this case. But when it's so dark, when it's so stormy, it's like everything stands still. Is this not ever going to get over? Are we going to be in this forever? It's dark and there's no moon, there's no sun, there's no nothing. You marched through the land in indignation. You trampled the nations in anger. You went forth for the salvation of your people. Why did he do all of this? He wasn't angry with the rivers. He wasn't angry with the sea. He was bringing salvation to his people. For salvation with your anointed. You struck the head of the house of the wicked by laying bare from foundation to neck. Selah. You thrust through with his own arrows the head of his villages. They came out like a whirlwind to scatter me. Their rejoicing was like feasting on the poor in secret. You walked through the sea with your horse, through the heap of great waters. That's a description that Habakkuk gives. In most commentaries, this is what it's replying to. But it's not something that we often look at. How God went before Israel. Deborah, she compares the effect the power of God had on the mountains of Canaan to the effect it had on Sinai. When she says, the mountains gushed before the Lord, this Sinai before the Lord God of Israel. In other words, the mountains of Israel gushed. This was this Sinai. This appearance of God. This effect of God on the mountains of Israel, the same as it affected Sinai. And this is something we use today, you hear things, about maybe Woodstock is a good example. This was Woodstock back whenever, the 60s, whenever it was. And they'll say, well, this is today's Woodstock. Talking about. So we see that same idea. Not that it was the same mountain, but it was the same effect that God had on the mountains. The subject of this portion of the psalm is the triumphant march of Israel, with the Lord at their head to take possession of Canaan, and the overthrow of Sihon, Og, and the Midianites. This march commenced from Kadesh in the immediate neighborhood of Seir, and the victories which followed were an exact parallel to the victory of Deborah and Barak, accompanied as it had been with the storm which made Kishon to overflow its banks. So what Deborah was writing about here was exactly the same thing that happened when God led Joshua into the promised land. There was the same force and storm. Wow, some interesting things here, isn't there? All right, let's move on. Verses 6 through 9. This is the former miseries, from the miseries of former times, glories to their present state. Beginning in verse 6. In the days of Shamgar, son of Anath, in the days of Jael, the highways were deserted and the travelers walked along the byways. Village life ceased. It ceased in Israel until I, Deborah, arose a mother in Israel. They chose new gods. Then there was war in the gates. Not a shield or a spear was found among 40,000 in Israel. My heart is with the rulers of Israel, who offered themselves willingly with the people. Bless the Lord. Now remember Shamgar. We don't learn much about him. He's only in one verse. But evidently Shamgar was a contemporary with Jael. Now I didn't put maps in here, but you'll remember the lower part of Canaan. The Philistines controlled that area. And you'll remember we talked last week, last lesson, about how that was a place that was being really persecuted by Philistines. The roads were so bad you couldn't go out on the roads. Everything was absolutely dangerous to step out anywhere. And you'll remember we talked about how Heber, which was the husband of Jael, probably migrated from there up into northern Israel, into the valley of Jezreel. Because originally, when it talks about Heber, he went into the south area, down around Hebron and that lower area down there. And because of the persecution, it's quite possible he moved north. And so, and you remember when he went north, he became not friends. I don't think that's really the right thing, but he made kind of an alliance with Jabin, and so he was able to stay there in peace. For one thing, they weren't warlike. They were shepherds. They were just tending their flocks. You know, that was Heber and his wife Jael. They weren't soldiers. They're not going to cause any trouble. And of course, allowing them to be there enabled Jabin to get information, and that's how he knew that Israel was putting an army together up on Mount Tabor. So, in the time of Shamgar and Jael, when they were down together in that same, not necessarily, they may not have ever known each other, but they were in that same part of the country. You couldn't walk out on the road. You couldn't take a walk. You couldn't walk from town to town. It was full of robbers and soldiers and people who were going to take your life. And so that was what it was like in that time. Now notice this. Village life ceased. There were no villages. Now, the villages were towns that were unwalled. Now, they didn't have protection. And so you had these little villages. They had village gates and things, but they weren't protective walls. In other words, they weren't built to withstand an army. They might keep the coyotes out, to the extent of what that was going to do. Okay? So village life had ceased because if you didn't have the protection of walls, you were apt to get raided and probably killed. So everybody had moved into walled cities, towns, or up into the mountains. All this took effect, and this was what was going on when Deborah arose. It takes a leader to arise. A lot of people have leadership qualities. A lot of people can be tremendous leaders. But unless they arise, unless they stand up, unless they face the issue, they'll never be a leader. It's just the way it is. In business, if you have leaders in business, business owners, managers, whatever, and they know the problems are there, they know there's a situation that needs to be dealt with, but if they sit back and say, well, I'm making good money and the company's doing all right, well, that'll take care of itself in time, what eventually happens is it will eat the business up and the business goes out of business. A good example is Sears. I'm going to use some business stuff here. I'm teaching a business class, a management class, and some of this is some of the, so I'm going to use some of that because it's here. But the thing about Sears, when you look at Sears, to me it's amazing. Sears was the first one, if you really want to look at it in a kind of a different way, Sears was the first one in e-commerce. Everybody had a Sears catalog. You could buy anything on Sears catalog. Now, they didn't have computers, they didn't have, stuff we have, but you could order this stuff and it was sent directly to you.
Yeah.
You could order Model T Ford to you in a crate.
Yeah.
And what happened? Well, all of a sudden, the catalog business started going down, they opened malls. And so Sears thought, the future is in malls. And so they went and opened stores in malls. Pretty soon they cut off their catalog business. I cried. I used to go to Seattle to the big catalog place where it's now Starbucks. I don't know if you were ever up there. They used to have a basement, and the whole basement was returns and discounts. You could go down there and find anything from Sears catalog. You could find it down there for half price, sometimes the wrong color, it didn't fit. They just throw it in the basement, discount it, and sell it off. Same thing stores do today. But they got out of the catalog business. And then when all of a sudden e-commerce took off and a company named Amazon came along, and they started doing the very same thing Sears had been doing, you would think Sears would be the first one to say, oh, hey, we got to get this thing back up and we can be trailblazers, we can be in front of this. But they sat back and said, it's a fly in the pan, it'll go away. I'm not going to worry about it. Today, Amazon's one of the largest companies in the world. Sears is filing bankruptcy, or it just escaped maybe filing it, shutting down stores. When you have leaders that don't lead, the result is going to be defeat. If Deborah had stayed under the tree and did nothing but judge, Israel would have never had the victory. And probably would have been completely overrun by Jabin at some point because he was growing in strength. But she arose. Now, she says this, Deborah arose, a mother in Israel. Now, what is there about mothers? A mother is one who instructs, rules, and protects.
Yeah.
That's what a mother does. She could judge, she could instruct, and she could rule. She could make rules, a certain amount of rules, in conjunction with her judgments. But she had to protect. The only way you could protect was to get up and lead. Take out whatever the problem is, whatever's harassing, get rid of that, in order to protect the children of Israel. Now she goes on to say, they chose new gods. The old God wasn't good enough. The old God only fed them in the desert, provided water for them, had their clothes never wore out. The old God only came into the promised land with thunder, lightning, hail. The old God wasn't good enough for us. We're tired of the old God, and so we're going to get new gods. And people do that today. They get tired of the old God because they pray and God doesn't answer the way they think God should answer. He doesn't provide them with the things they think He should provide them with. He demands of them that they have a certain level of faith, level of holiness, which by the way, holiness is not an act, but it is a position, a certain matter of holiness, so you can be in the presence of God, because without holiness, no man can see God. So it is a position, it's a way of being in a condition that God can see you. It requires that we put God first. It requires that we allow Him to take care of us. And surprisingly enough, that is the hardest thing for people to do. I can't allow God to take care of me. I spent all this money to go to college. I have all of these years of experience. And you expect me to sit down and say, God, take care of me. I'm perfectly able of taking care of myself. Now, that seems strange, but that is exactly what people do. I've talked to enough people, and I see them all the time. You say, the reason you're not succeeding is because you allow God to take care of you. Pay your tithes, give your offerings. Try God. Let Him take care of you. Put Him first. But I won't be able to pay bills. What He's saying is that I'm able to take care of myself. If I'll be able to pay the bills. If I rely on God, He will not pay my bills. That's exactly what people are saying. And so what are they saying? I need a new God. Me. Or I need a new God. I'm investing in the stock market. The stock market becomes their new God. Whatever you put your energies into, whatever is most important to you, becomes your new God. Yeah. And sometimes we have very good reasons for doing that, we think. And I'm not going to go into all of it, but we sometimes look at our families and different things and we say it has to be best for the family. If you make it the best for God, it will be the best for the family. In growing up, I was a very busy guy. I think I'm busy now. There were actually times, it happened on more than one occasion, when I would college bus and go on a Friday night halfway down the state of California to sing maybe a Friday night at a concert with the choir. After the concert, I would get on a bus and I would go clear to the other end almost of the state in order to be ready to run in a track meet the next day. That's the kind of, I was constantly busy between music and sports, and I was going all the time. But the one thing that I was careful of, and my parents, all the years I ran track, and I ran from the time I was in junior high school all the way in college. I was conference champion. I can only remember once when my dad ever came to a track meet. Only once, and that's because it was by my house. I had a junior college, it was up the road from our house, less than a mile. So he came over to watch. Otherwise, my parents never once saw me in a football game, never once saw me in a track meet. And people would say, that's terrible, you're not supporting your son. They supported me like you wouldn't believe. For me. They took me to church. We had revivals that went for 2 and 3 weeks every night, and we were there every night. That meant I got up sometimes very early in the morning to get to school in time for a track workout, so I could do it in the morning at church that night. People say, that's terrible. Well, I think I turned out okay. If they had followed my thing, and by the way, I got offered a big scholarship to go to the #1 track school in the United States at that time, which was San Jose State University. I got a big scholarship. I could have went. Chose to go to a junior college and on to Bible school. Why? Why did you give that up? Well, that was the thing God wanted me to do. It was that simple. And when I look back on it, I could have run 4 years. Here, I could have probably gone there, ran 4 years in track. I could have got some nice letters and maybe some nice trophies and, you know, things, and it could have really been nice. Then what? I'd have had my bachelor's degree. Maybe I'd have found some work. I don't know. But by following God and allowing Him to direct my life, you know what I ended up with? PhD. Honor Society. Considered an expert in management. Could I have ever done that if I had followed the course of my life? No. I know I couldn't have. So when we allow Him to direct our paths, when God and His service comes first, He takes care of us. We can praise the Lord because He will give us the victory. All right. All right. Notice those new gods. Then there was war in the gates. That means the gates of the villages and towns. That means the armies came. That means there was war in the gates and they were overrunning the cities. It's not a shield or spear was seen among 40,000 in Israel. That doesn't mean nobody in Israel had spears and shields, but there were 40,000 in the southern part of the state of the nation that did not have spears or shields. Why? They had run and all of their arms had been taken away from them. They could no longer defend themselves. And then along came a guy named Shamgar, and he fixed it in the south. All right, we got to move on. Deborah, she has a very deep admiration for and honor for those leaders who willingly volunteered to bring their soldiers together and fight against Sisera. Judges chapter 5, verse 10 to 12. Speak, ye who ride on white donkeys, who sit in judges' attire, and who walk along the road, far from the noise of the archers, among the watering places. There they shall recount the righteous acts of the Lord, the righteous acts for His villagers in Israel. Then the people of the Lord shall go down to the gates. Awake, awake, Deborah, awake, awake, sing a song, arise, Barak, and lead your captives away, O son of Abinoam. Who are the ones on white donkeys? These were the wealthy, the rulers of Israel. And donkeys is because the white donkey is very rare and it was very costly. So you had to have a lot of money in order to have one of these donkeys. But notice, it said, riding donkeys who sit in judges' attire. These are the rulers, the ones who judge. And who walk along the road. Now wait a minute, you couldn't walk along the road before. Now you can walk along the road. See? The roads are now safe. Far from the noise of the archers among the watering places. What used to happen in the watering places were one of two things. It was either a very serene, quiet place where you could go and get water. It was a place where people visited. you know, while you were drawing water, it was a place where you swapped stories, and it was a resting place, and usually it was in some kind of a shaded area outside of the village or the city. But in times of distress, it was a very dangerous place, because the enemy knew people had to go to the well. So the archers would hide in the rocks or in the forest, and when people came to the well, they would shoot them. So what Deborah is saying here, that you're far from the noise of the archers when you go to the wells. There's nobody there that's going to shoot you. That's nice to know. And you're in those watering places. And while you're there in the safety of the watering places with no archers to worry about, what are you going to do? You're going to talk about the righteous acts. The way he delivered his villagers. They shall recount the righteous acts. In other words, you're going to tell the story over and over and over again. Then the people of the Lord shall go down to the gates. They're going to go back to their villages. They're going to go back to their towns. Not to make war, but to move back in and take over again their cities. Notice verse 12. Verse 12 to me is a fantastic scripture. Awake, awake, Deborah, awake. Huh? Deborah's out under the tree. She's judging. And suddenly she hears, awake and sing a song. So she gets up on a rock. She starts singing some aria from an opera, right? Never mind. How could you sing a song unless you first had the victory? This was a statement of faith. Wake up, get up, Deborah, lead, and sing a song. See the victory before it happens. Sing the song of victory before there is victory. Arise, Barak, and lead your captive, O son of Abinon. You couldn't have until you first had the victory. The Bible says every one of the enemy was wiped out. But it doesn't mean they were all killed at the Brook Kidron, because as is customary, they would take the important soldiers, that would be the officers and some of the others, and they would parade them. And they would take these captives around and say, these are the ones who were punishing Israel, and we have defeated them. And after they were all done parading them around, they would kill them.
Oh.
It was a way of saying to the neighboring kings and everybody else, look, you see these guys? It's going to happen to you next if you don't straighten up. That put it in vernacular.
Yeah.
All right. So, again, a statement of faith. The call wasn't for Barak to form an army. The call wasn't for Barak to lead the army into battle. The call to Barak was to lead the captives. Look beyond the battle to the victory. See beyond the struggle. See beyond the danger. See beyond the fear and see what God is to do and lead the captives. Make a plan. What's your parade going to consist of? Where are you going to go when you lead these captives? Plan for victory. That's part of good leadership, by the way. All right, let's move on. Verses 13 to 18. He commends the chiefs of the tribe who went forth willingly to battle and checks the unwilling who carried it home. Then the survivors came down, the people against the nobles. The Lord came down for me against the mighty. Here we see the survivors. Who were the survivors? These were the ones in the north. At the beckoning of Deborah, the remnant or the survivors of soldiers and leaders, most of them had been defeated and they didn't have standing armies and things, but they had leaders and they had soldiers. They came against the rulers of Canaan, and then the Lord came against the mighty. It's a process. if you will put what you have together and you give it to God, and you are determined for the victory, when you step out, God will go before you and He'll take care of the mighty. You just have to worry about stepping out and doing what God wants you to do. That army that Barak formed was not just to come against Sisera, but against Jabin and the other Canaanite rulers. By destroying Sisera, he destroyed the power of Jabin and the power of the other rulers. He looked beyond the immediate enemy at the effect. All right. Now, these remnant of soldiers. Verse 14. From Ephraim were those whose roots were in Amalek. After you, Benjamin, with your peoples from Machir, rulers came down. And from Zebulun, those who bear the recruiter's staff. And the princes of Ishkar were with Deborah. As Ishkar, so was Barak sent into the valley under his command. And I want to stop right there. The soldiers came from Ephraim, and they had been harassed by Amalek. So they were persecuted by Amalek. You know, we found one instance where they joined forces to defeat another king, but otherwise they were at odds with each other all the time. So you had the men from Ephraim. Then Benjamin, small tribe, poor tribe, didn't have a big bunch of people to send, but they sent who they had. And from half the tribe of Manasseh, which dwelt in Jordan. And who did they provide? What did they provide? They provided the military officers and the commanders. You know, we think about Barak putting 10,000 men together. You really think he's going to lead 10,000 men by himself into a battle? No. You're going to have commanders, and they're, you know, it's just like the Roman legions. You know, each commander is going to have so many men under him, and they're going to have an assigned area to go and fight. This was a battle plan. This is something that, you know, we read these stories and get the impression Barak, you know, took 4 or 5 days to get over to Mount Tabor, and everybody just came up on the mountain and they pitched their tents for a couple of days and marched down to battle. No, they put together a battle plan. They put together an army. And so they got the leaders and the commanders. They came over from Manasseh, which was known for their warring ability and to plan and to do. They were on the other side of Jordan, see. They provided those military officers and commanders. Zebulun, in their consistency, now they provided arms, they provided an army, you know, people to fight, but it also included the military scribes that kept the records and saw to the recruiting of the army. And one commentary talks about the fact that, from the way it's written, they sent letters. So they were the ones who sent out letters and said, hey, we're going to put this army together. Send your troops. Right? That came from Zebulun. Ishkar supported Deborah and was as committed and valiant as Barak. Now, so we see the ones that were the main driving force. Now, look what she says. In verse 15, halfway through, it says, among the divisions of Reuben, there were great resolves of heart. Now that sounds exciting, doesn't it? Here were among the divisions of Reuben. Well, that tells us something. Number one, Reuben was divided. They weren't united in their thinking. Among the divisions, there was this feeling of, nationalism. Yes, sir. We need to go join the army. We need to get involved when there's a passion there, you know. But notice what she goes on to say. Why did you sit among the sheepfolds? to hear the pipings of the flocks? The divisions of Reuben have great searchings of heart. In other words, while everybody was going off to get an army together, Reuben stayed with the sheep. Why did you stay there? So you could listen to the pipings or the braying or whatever of the sheep, the lowing of the sheep, or whatever the word is. Is that why you stayed there, just so you could hear those sheep? And sometimes people who fail to get into the battle, who fail to go put themselves in that position of being out into the battle, putting on the whole armor and all of that, it's like staying home so they can listen to the sheep. Look what I've got. Hey, I'm happy here. I can sit here under the stars. I can play my harp and sing songs, and the sheep accompany me. Isn't that wonderful? Oh, what a life. While you're dodging, looking, constantly watching to see if somebody's going to go steal those sheep. Gilead stayed beyond Jordan. And why did Dan remain on ships? Asher continued at the seashore and stayed by its inlets. She's talking here about those who failed. Gilead was on the west side of the Jordan River, or east side of the Jordan River, rather, and it included the tribes of Gad and the eastern half of Manasseh. And they stayed on the other side of Jordan. Hey, we're over here. Whatever you want to do with that land's up to you. We are happy where we're at. We have our land. Leave us alone. And we look at Dan. Now Dan dwelt along the seashore as well as Asher. But Dan was more seafaring. They were fishermen who fished in the Mediterranean Sea. Larger ships than what you have in the Sea of Galilee. They were also tradesmen, so they took ships out and traded from the islands and around. Asher were more, they were on ships also some, but they were more the ones who took care of the goods that came in. So they were tradesmen, trading goods and so forth. So while everybody was putting an army together, they got on their ships and, well, if the battle gets too tight, we can just go out to sea and we'll be safe. Asher, they're going to hang around the coves and the inlets, where they can be safe, and they can always jump on a ship if they have to, but they're going to keep up their goods, and they're going to keep their business, and they're going to keep the goods flowing. I mean, after all, we have to have these goods or the country won't survive. See the excuses? You see what they were doing? Notice verse 18. Zebulon is a people who jeopardized their lives to the point of death. Naphtali also on the heights of the battlefield. Oh, here she is commending Zebulon and Naphtali. She singles them out for risking their lives as they assembled on Mount Tabor and prepared to march down into battle. Wow. All right, let's move on. Judges 5, 19 to 22. The kings came and fought. Then the kings of Canaan fought in Tanakh by the waters of Megiddo. They took no spoils of silver. They fought from the heavens. The stars from their courses fought against Sisera. The torrent of Kishon swept them away. That ancient torrent, the torrent of Kishon. O my soul, march on in strength. Then the horse's hooves pounded, the galloping of his steeds. Whoa. This is exciting. Because here's what we have, the two forces that came together to battle. First of all, you had the kings that came and fought. the kings of Canaan fought in Tanakh by the waters of Megiddo. Tanakh and Megiddo were two towns in that time. Tanakh was a town that belonged to who was it? Manasseh. And when they divided the land, when Joshua came into the promised land, he gave that city to Manasseh. Manasseh in turn gave it to the Levites, because the Levites could not own anything. So it was given to the Levites to be a place for them to live and have their lives. That was Tanakh. Megiddo was another town that was on the plains, and it was on a little bluff, and it overlooked the valley of Jezreel. Now, they came to that place to fight. Now, these kings, and this included Sisera, were coming with the intent of destroying Israel. They were going to meet Israel, they were going to destroy them, and they were already thinking about the spoils. How much silver do you think we'll get out of this victory? Notice what it says. They came to Megiddo. They took no spoils of silver. Why didn't they? They didn't win. All right. Now, who were they fighting against? They fought from the heavens. The stars from their courses fought against Sisera. This is what Josephus tells about this battle. He relates that just as the battle began, a violent tempest came on with a great downpour of rain and hailstones, which, driving full in the forces of the Canaanites, so blinded and benumbed them with cold, that they could never use their bows with effect, nor even hold their swords. So you see, when we were looking at Psalms and Habakkuk, it's easy to say, well, that could have been any battle. Here it is. Josephus records it as history, that this tremendous storm came on the kings and on the armies of Sisera. And it wasn't as the battle began, it was when Barak marched down the hill. He didn't have horses, by the way. He had to walk. When the armies of Barak came down off of Mount Tabor, this storm hit. How do I know it happened then? Because when we read here, along with the others, Kishon became a roaring river. It wasn't the little river that you could easily walk across. You see, the armies had come from the other side of Kishon. They were very easy to walk across the river. It was a stream, really, kind of like the Jordan River in some of the areas where you could actually walk across it. It's not that deep. And so they were going to walk across Kishon. And they got all ready and they started to go into battle. They saw the armies of Israel coming off of Tabor, and bang! Hailstones, pouring rain, lightning, thunder, the things Barak or Deborah talked about earlier. Can you imagine? You've got all of these horses. Now, if you know anything about horses, I know a lot about horses, and when things go sideways, there's storms and stuff going, these horses can go nuts. And I don't care how hard you work, you're not going to control those horses. You got horses with these chariots, and they're going wild. And you got guys who are trying to get their bows out, and it's so cold they're freezing with the hail pounding on them, and the water is rising. And all of this is going on, and the thunder and the lightning, and they don't know who's who in the zoo. And suddenly they're fighting each other. They're destroying each other. The chariots are running over everybody. The horses' hooves are pounding on them. Yeah, you see? It wasn't the army of Israel. It was the armies of heaven. The stars, as Deborah calls them. Another form of meaning, a supernatural army from heaven. They fought against Sisera. The torrent of Kishon swept them away. Flash flood. They're trying to get back across the river, and the river is just picking them up and rolling them down the way and dumping them off into the sea. The ancient torrent, the torrent of Kishon, the same Kishon that swept away the inhabitants of Canaan when Joshua crossed the Jordan River. Notice what it says. Oh, my soul, march on in strength. When we see what God can do, we should be so strong in marching ahead. What can possibly stand in our way? Verse 22, then the horses' hooves pounded. That word pounded literally means to pound and break in pieces. They pounded. The galloping of the steeds. You can see these horses, they're going wild. They're pounding, they're trying to get away. They're pounding on the rocks. And in those days, they didn't shoe the horses. They didn't have horseshoes. So it was just the hooves. And they're pounding so hard to get away. They're breaking their hooves, breaking their feet. That's what happens when God fights for us. All right. I got a lot of bunch of stuff here, but we got to move on. You'll notice that, can you just imagine the dead bodies as they roll into the Mediterranean Sea?
Yeah.
From Kishon. All of this boiling, all of this water is spraying, and in the midst of this, here comes a dead body to the surface off the waves, and they're being thrown out into the sea. The sharks are gathering around for a feast. All right. All right. All right, let's move on. Verse 23, Meroz is cursed for not coming to their assistance. Now, verse 23 says, curse Meroz, says the angel of the Lord. Curse its inhabitants bitterly, because they did not come to the help of the Lord, against the mighty. All right, a couple things here, very quickly. Meroz was a village, and it laid in the course, or the area, of the escaping fugitives. So in other words, those soldiers who were trying to run away had to go by Meroz.
Okay.
The bitter curse on Meroz was not pronounced by Deborah, because Meroz, they just shut the gates and hunkered down under the bed. They didn't want to be involved. But it was by the angel of the Lord. This tells me something. The angel of the Lord always refers to that theophany, that form that God took on when he wanted to talk to somebody in the Old Testament. It was a theophany that appeared to Abraham. It was a theophany that wrestled with Jacob. All right? And so what this tells me is that Deborah conversed with the angel of the Lord. It never told us how she knew to rise up and go to battle. She never said who, was there a voice out of heaven or whatever. This gives us some indication that she maybe had regular communications with the angel of the Lord, often called the angel of the Lord's presence also. Because it was the angel of the Lord who pronounced a bitter curse on this town of Meroz. It's interesting, it's because they didn't help the Lord. Did the Lord need help? Could they have done anything at all to help the Lord? No. What were they going to do? Stick a foot out and trip them? I don't know. To help the Lord against the mighty. The point here with God is not how successful we are in what we do. People say, I can't do anything because I'm not as good as somebody else. It won't do any good for me to, because it just, nothing will happen. I don't have the skill. I don't have this. I don't have that. God doesn't care. God never promised us that we would have any success in doing anything for Him. He didn't. The only success He promised us is if we are faithful to do what He tells us to do, He will bless us. It doesn't say that in the endeavor we'll be successful. And yet we want to measure everything by success. All He wanted them to do was their best. Step out and help us stop these people, these soldiers, from running away. Would God have given them a victory? Yes. They could have been included with those that received honor and praise. As it was, Munoz is not even mentioned anywhere. It has been completely obliterated for centuries. Nobody knows anything about it other than the biblical account. When God cursed it, He completely cursed it. I mean, it's nothing there. All right, move on, verses 24 to 27. Hey, we might even finish almost on time. Verse 24, most blessed among women is Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Blessed is she among women in tents. He asked for water, she gave milk. She brought out cream in a lordly bowl. She stretched her hand to the tent peg, her right hand to the workman's hammer. She pounded Sisera. She pierced his head. She split and struck through his temple. At her feet he sank. He fell. He lay still. At her feet he sank. He fell. Where he sank, there he fell dead. I mean, all right, fine. Like something out of a Halloween movie or something, horror show. But notice Jael is to be honored, celebrated, and praised among the women who dwell in tents for her actions in slaying Sisera. Among the Canaanites, she's to be blessed. She wasn't an Israelite. She wasn't of the tribe of Benjamin or Gad or someplace. But she was to be blessed. We add her name to the others, such as Ruth, that we just fit through, and Rahab, and the others that were not Jewish, not Hebrew, and yet God blessed them, and He pronounced a blessing on them because of their acts. As vicious as this was, as terrible as we may think, because it talks about how she laid a trap for him. She invited him into his tent. He was probably very suspicious of anybody at this point. No army, no guards with him. He's by himself, probably something he hadn't been in a long time. Comes into her tent and wants some water, and she gives him, says, here, cream, the best, in the royal bowl, in the best bowl, the best she had. She gave it to him and covered him with the blanket and, hiding him, and everything is going to be okay. While she was reaching for the tent peg and the hammer. You see, she used what she had.
Right.
There were no weapons in the women's tent. And I doubt she'd know how to use a sword, a spear. I mean, it'd be like saying, hey, here's my gun, shoot somebody. If you don't know anything about a gun, you wouldn't even know how to get a shell in it, let alone shoot somebody, right? But the thing she knew how to use was a tent peg and a hammer. She was well skilled at driving tent pegs because they were nomads, and they took their tents down and moved them and put them back up, and the women were the ones generally who did a lot of the tent peg work. So she was, she knew how to drive a tent peg. And so she took what she had and used it to defeat the enemy. What we need to gain from that is that no matter what we have, use it to defeat the enemy. Whatever it is, God has given all of us skills, all of us things that we can use to defeat the enemy. We just have to use them. All right. And he died at the feet of Jael. Now, this is an interesting little section that she puts in here about the court of Sisera. Judges 5 and 28 to 30. The mother of Sisera looked through the window and cried out through the lattice, "Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why tarries the clatter of his chariots?" Now this is the mother of Sisera, and this is this is his mother, and you all mothers, if your kid is late, and I'm a father, and I remember some of the kids, when we were growing up, they would be late. They weren't where they were, and the first thing crosses your mind, I wonder if they got in a wreck. I wonder if there's a problem.
Yeah.
What happened? And the longer it went, the more the mother of Sisera became concerned. For one thing, they had the assumption that it wasn't going to take them any time at all to wipe out Israel. These 10,000 soldiers don't have a chance. Our chariots are going to take them down 45 minutes max. That's over. We're going to be back. And also, she may have seen the storm. She may have been in the storm. And so she was concerned, and she's looking out the lattice. And they didn't have window glass, they had lattice, and that let the cool breezes through. And she's looking out the lattice, and she's listening for the beat of the hooves, and she doesn't see her son. And so she's crying out, she's concerned. Notice verse 29. Her wisest ladies answered her. Yes, she answered herself. The wisest ones, and by the way, the wisest are still fools in the sight of God. The wisest ones answered her, and she agreed. She answered herself. Where is he? Oh, I know what's going on, sure. There was more spoils than they thought. Verse 30. Are they not finding and dividing the spoil? To every man a girl or two. For Sisera, plunder of dyed garments, plunder of garments embroidered and dyed. 2 pieces of dyed embroidery for the neck of the looter. Now see, they were looking to the victory.
Yeah.
They weren't looking at the battle, they were looking at the victory. They'd already gained the victory. If we had the faith of these women, we might get somewhere if we had their approach. We always want to look at the battle. They were looking at the victory. But they didn't have their faith in the right place. Back in the town of Harosheth, here's Sisera's mother waiting. And here's the foolish ladies. And what they were saying was that every soldier would have a girdle or two, which was always a valued part of Oriental conquerors' war spoils. They would capture the women. Once they defeated the army, they would move into the towns and they would just take all the women, the young virgins and damsels, and sometimes they get to have 2 of them. And they would have the spoils of war. But for Sisera, and the commentaries seem to think this was Sisera's mother who chimed in on this one. For Sisera, not the girls. That was mom, you don't need those girls. Forget the girls. The spoils would be a booty, a gold threaded, richly embroidered, and scarlet covered cloaks, which were held in such high esteem. These would be the cloaks that were worn by the leaders of the army. Barak and the others from Zebulun that came over, to Manasseh that came over to lead the army, the commanders, they all had these very elaborate robes, and It singled them out as being the leaders, and everybody knew who their leaders were. It would also include two-party dyed, that means bright and colored, and embroidered claws that would be put around the neck of the one gathering the spoils. This could also mean the necks of the camels carrying the spoils. And if you look at Judges 8:21 and 26, there's a little story about how they took these colored pieces of cloth, embroidery cloth, off the necks of the camels after they defeated an army. And so when they had the spoils, they would put these brightly colored cloths around the necks of the camels, or around the, if a soldier was carrying these spoils, he would have these around his neck. And what it said is, victory, these are my spoils. I'm coming in with my spoils. I'm leading the camel who is carrying my spoils. And so that's what they assumed was going on. Actually, of course, we know what happened. Now, the last verse of this chapter is Deborah praying for like judgment on the enemies of God. She says, "Thus let all your enemies perish, O Lord. But let those who love him be like the sun when it comes out in full strength." So the land had rest for 40 days. Let the enemies of God be defeated. Let them be wiped out. Let them go without any spoils. Let them have no victories. But let those who love him be like the sun in its full strength. What is there about the sun in its full strength? This refers to the dawn. The full strength of the sun drives out darkness. Darkness. And those that love him, let them drive out all darkness. What a prayer. Any questions? Actually, I'm on time. I'm late getting started, so.